Hey there, welcome to the deep dive.
Mm.
Today we are plunging headfirst into something that is, well, absolutely revolutionary, I think. It really challenges how we've traditionally thought about our bodies, our health.
Uh-huh.
We're talking about the secret, constant conversation happening between your gut and your brain. And, not just them, but this entire universe of trillions of microbes living inside you.
It's pretty mind-boggling stuff.
Totally. Think about how we used to see the human body, right?
Yeah.
Like a really complex machine, lots of separate parts,
Hmm.
the heart, the lungs, the stomach, the brain, each doing its own thing.
Yeah, the fix-it approach. Fix the heart, you fix the heart problem. Simple. Or seemingly simple.
Exactly. Well, the stack of sources we're diving into today, and we're drawing quite a bit from Dr. Emran Mayer's The Mind-Gut Connection, argues that this old machine model,
Hmm.
it just isn't cutting it anymore.
Yeah.
Especially when we look at the explosion of chronic diseases.
Right.
So our mission in this deep dive is basically to pull out the most important knowledge nuggets from these sources to really understand this incredible inner world and how it impacts our health, our emotions, maybe even our decisions in like really profound ways.
And you hit on something crucial there. The source material makes it incredibly clear that this isn't just, a scientific curiosity.
Yeah.
Understanding this deeply interconnected system is vital because of the immense human suffering and, frankly, the staggering healthcare costs tied to chronic diseases and mental health issues today.
Yeah.
That traditional approach, I mean, it was effective for acute problems, sure, but it simply hasn't provided the answers we need for these modern health crises.
Okay, so let's unpack this revolutionary idea then. To really get how far we've come, we kind of need to look back at how medicine used to think about the body.
The old model.
Yeah, the old model, the body as a machine, back around, what, 1970? When the author of our main source started medical school, this was pretty much the dominant view.
Standard thinking, yeah.
The parts were seen as largely independent. And medicine was incredibly successful at tackling acute problems. Infections, injuries, heart attacks, things needing surgery.
Absolutely. They had powerful tools. Antibiotics were miracle drugs. Surgery got incredibly sophisticated. And you had drugs targeting really specific malfunctions like beta blockers for blood pressure or those proton pump inhibitors to just shut down stomach acid.
Right. And honestly, it saved countless lives. It revolutionized medicine in so many ways, you can't deny that.
No question. But the limitation, it became really glaring as a different kind of health crisis emerged over the last, say, 40 to 50 years.
It is.
The surge in chronic diseases. The sources point out that issues like obesity, autoimmune disorders, irritable bowel syndrome, even neurological conditions, they just don't behave like a single broken part.
Right. You can't just swap out a component.
Exactly. They involve these complex regulatory mechanisms that span across systems, how we process food, our metabolism, our immune system, and critically, brain health. The big insight emerging from the sources is that the gut microbiome, the actual microbes living there, and the microbiome, which is like their collective toolkit of genes and chemicals, they aren't just side players. They are major components in these complex, interconnected systems.
It's kind of wild to think about that shift in perspective. The author shares his personal story, right?
Yeah.
About being in medical school, wanting to study the brain-body interaction.
Yeah, I remember reading that.
And basically being dismissed by a senior professor who felt the psyche wasn't something you could scientifically study. Like it was too fuzzy.
Wow. That was the prevailing mindset just a few decades ago. It really shows you.
It does. And that historical anecdote, it takes on even more weight when you look at the numbers the sources bring up.
The healthcare cost paradox.
Yeah, exactly. The U.S. system. It's the most expensive per capita among developed nations, right? The cost has gone up, over 2,000% per person since 1970? That's according to reports cited from the WHO and Commonwealth Fund.
Staggering numbers.
But its health outcomes, overall performance, ranked much lower.
Yeah, it's a huge disconnect. And it strongly suggests that the old machine model is just missing something fundamental when it comes to getting at the root causes driving today's chronic health problems.
Yeah, I mean, look at the obesity stats presented in the source. That's a perfect example of a chronic problem the machine model just isn't handling effectively.
Heard the numbers again?
Going from like 13% of the population being obese in 1972 to 35% in 2012.
Yeah.
And projecting these enormous annual costs, like $620 billion, if that trend keeps going. It's a massive systemic issue.
Exactly. And the profound insight here, the real paradigm shift we need, is moving from seeing the body as a machine to understanding it as an interconnected ecological system.
An ecosystem, yeah.
Instead of thinking about waging war on individual microbes or, fixing isolated parts. The sources encourage us to think more like a friendly park ranger.
Huh, I like that. A park ranger for your gut.
Yeah, focused on fostering biodiversity and health within this internal ecosystem for overall resilience, not just attacking invaders.
That's a great analogy.
Mhm.
Okay, so let's dive into that inner ecosystem then, the gut microbiota. We're talking about this teeming city of trillions of microorganisms in our digestive tracts.
Trillions, it's hard to even conceive of.
And get this stat from the source.
Yeah.
Something like 100,000 times more microbial cells in your gut than there are people on Earth.
Whoa.
It's truly an inner universe. And, humans first got a hint of this tiny world way back with pioneers like Antony van Leeuwenhoek and his early microscope like 300 years ago.
But the real explosion of knowledge, especially about this gut-brain axis, that's much, much more recent. Like the last decade or two has been incredible.
Right. And this has brought the whole concept of dysbiosis, basically an imbalance in these microbial communities, front and center.
Exactly. And we now see these really strong links between dysbiosis and chronic gut disorders like IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, which apparently affects up to, 15% of people globally. That's huge.
Huge number.
The sources do note, though, that while we're uncovering these connections, the precise role of specific microbes and, the best ways to actually influence them, whether it's probiotics, specific diets, maybe even fecal transplants, that's all still a very active area of research. We don't have all the answers yet.
No, definitely not. It's interesting that the author talks about his own initial skepticism, right?
Mhm.
About the link between gut microbes and the brain. Based on those early animal studies, that just seemed almost too wild to be true.
Yeah, mice behaving differently based on their gut bugs. It sounds like science fiction initially.
Right. But his own research group at UCLA did some of the early human studies that actually confirmed those animal findings. And he said that was a real turning point, propelling him to dig deeper into how these tiny organisms might influence our emotions, our social interactions, maybe even our decisions.
And that exploration became incredibly significant because, as the sources highlight, these altered gut microbiota have been increasingly linked to the dramatic rise of conditions like autism spectrum disorders, autoimmune diseases, metabolic disorders, all over the last 50 years or so.
Wow.
It's a profound insight, really. It suggests there might be some common underlying mechanism, maybe a root cause for these seemingly separate modern diseases, possibly tied to huge shifts in our lifestyle, our diet, the widespread use of antibiotics, things like that.
It even connects to neurodegenerative diseases, which
Well,
is just
yeah.
mind-blowing. The sources point out the rising rates of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's.
Scary stuff.
And there's this fascinating finding. The nerve degeneration you typically see in Parkinson's, it can actually start in the enteric nervous system, that sort of second brain in your gut, years before the classic brain symptoms even show up.
Years before, wow.
Yeah. Plus, significant gut microbial changes seem to go along with the disease progression. So this raises a really compelling possibility that alterations in how gut microbes function could play a role in kicking off or influencing both Parkinson's and maybe Alzheimer's too.
It's just such a powerful indication of how deeply interconnected these systems are. The health of your gut can literally impact the health of your brain over the long haul.
Okay, let's shift a bit and talk about how this inner world connects to something we all experience every single day,
Yeah.
our emotions.
The gut feelings.
Exactly. The sources describe just how directly your gut physically responds to what's going on in your head. You know that feeling, right? Like you're fuming in traffic.
Oh, yeah. Stomach clenches up.
Totally. Your stomach might churn, pump out more acid, slow down emptying. Anxiety or being really upset has its own distinct pattern of gut activity. And when someone's deeply depressed, apparently their intestines can practically stop moving.
That's incredible.
The source puts it so simply and powerfully. Your gut mirrors every emotion that arises in your brain.
And while these gut reactions are, incredibly common, who hasn't felt butterflies or that knot in their stomach, the medical system often kind of dismisses them if the standard tests, like an endoscopy, don't find obvious issues like inflammation or tumors.
Right. You get told it's just stress, maybe.
Yeah, or patients might be given diets or pills just to mask the symptoms without ever really addressing that fundamental link to their emotional state.
Which makes that historical anecdote from the sources about the army surgeon William Beaumont and the fur trapper Alexis St. Martin so compelling.
Oh, the guy with the hole in his stomach?
Yeah. St. Martin had this horrific accident, shot in the abdomen, left a permanent opening. So Beaumont had this unique, though definitely ethically questionable by today's standards, window into a living stomach.
Crazy.
He'd tie food to strings, lower it in, observe digestion. And he concluded, way back then, that the man's anger actually slowed down his digestion. That might have been the first scientific observation that emotions could physically mess with your stomach.
And that early observation, it holds up perfectly with modern science. The sources explain how chronic emotional states, like being persistently angry or anxious, don't just cause temporary reactions. They can actually lead to lasting physical changes in the gut over time.
Like what kind of changes?
Well, nerve connections can adapt, sensors in the gut lining can become more sensitive, serotonin production down there can shift, and yes, even the microbial community itself can change, maybe leading to more aggressive behavior from certain types of bacteria.
Wow. So your mood can literally change your microbes' mood, in a way.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
And the sources note that while therapies focused only on fixing the gut haven't been broadly successful for these brain-gut issues, interventions that help change the brain's emotional playbook, basically how the brain processes and responds to emotional signals, those seem much more promising.
So working on the brain side helps the gut side.
Exactly. There are even studies exploring if mind-based practices like hypnosis or meditation can actually influence the gut microbes themselves and improve symptoms.
That really hammers home that the conversation goes both ways, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And it seems like this whole brain-gut connection, this kind of programming, it starts incredibly early in life.
Oh, absolutely. Our genes play a role, for sure. Some of us might just be genetically predisposed to stronger gut reactions. But early life experiences, especially things like stress or trauma, can have a huge impact.
Right. The sources give that great example. Two people exposed to the exact same stressful situation, but their guts react completely differently because of their individual histories and programming.
And the sources emphasize that the effects of these triggered emotional programs, they can absolutely linger. They can influence our gut-brain axis way later in life, sometimes in really painful or confusing ways. Your thoughts, your memories, even your expectations can set off these old programs.
Like the restaurant example.
Yeah, that's a perfect one. You go back to a place where you had a terrible argument. The memory alone might trigger that old anger program, causing digestive upset. But you mistakenly blame the food, right, and not the emotional trigger. It really encourages you to sort of reflect on those connections in your own life.
The author, speaking as a clinician, really highlights how crucial it is to give patients with these brain-gut disorders like IBS or something called cyclical vomiting syndrome a clear scientific explanation for what's actually happening.
Takes away the mystery, the feeling of, it's all in my head.
Exactly. It relieves uncertainty and opens the door for tailored therapy, which might involve behavioral approaches, ways to calm the nervous system, and sometimes even low-dose medications to kind of quiet down those hyperactive stress circuits. He tells the story of Bill, who had faulty brakes on his fear response. Explaining why seemingly trivial things caused a massive gut reaction was the vital first step for him.
And it's so important to understand these aren't purely psychological issues. The sources show this with stories like Frank's. He developed worsening IBS and other symptoms after his wife died, likely due to this generalized hypersensitivity that was just exacerbated by the stress and maybe changes in diet.
Right.
These conditions have a strong biological basis. Your gut has this incredibly complex sensory machinery. It even has taste and smell receptors down there, constantly sending signals up to the brain. And the sources suggest maybe 10% of the population might perceive what are essentially corrupted or exaggerated signals from their gut.
Wow, 10%. So connecting early life stress more broadly.
Yeah.
Those landmark animal studies by Michael Meany that the sources describe, they're incredibly powerful, aren't they?
The rat mom studies, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely foundational.
He studied how the level of nurturing rat mothers provided actually programmed their pups' stress reactivity and their behavior later in life.
Right. The pups with the really attentive, nurturing moms, they grew up to be laid-back social explorers.
But the ones with negligent mothers,
They became anxious, more prone to addiction, kind of loners. And similar findings were seen in monkeys, too. It showed how powerful those early environmental inputs are.
and this is exactly what the sources mean by early programming of the nervous system, right?
Precisely. And what's really exciting, the sources note, is some recent work, like studies by Bushik's group, confirming that some of these psychological consequences of poor maternal care in animals were actually dependent on alterations in the gut microbiota.
Get out. So the microbes were mediating the psychological effects.
It seems so. which is groundbreaking because it suggests that maybe, just maybe, modulating the microbiome could become a treatment tool for stress-related disorders that have their roots way back in early adversity.
That is incredible. That Yanomami childbirth anecdote the sources share. It provides such a stark contrast to our modern world, doesn't it?
Totally. Think about natural birth, immediate skin-to-skin, exposure to the mother's rich microbial environment, versus a sterile hospital delivery, maybe a C-section.
Right. Practices like C-sections, early and frequent antibiotic use, even the mother's diet and stress levels during pregnancy and infancy, the sources suggest these can interfere with the normal, evolutionarily designed programming of the infant gut microbiome.
And this disruption, this early mismatch, could potentially lay the groundwork for immune problems, metabolic issues, maybe even neurodevelopmental disorders later in life.
And this is where breastfeeding comes in as absolutely crucial, according to the sources.
Hugely important, and not just for basic nutrition, but specifically because of these things called human milk oligosaccharides, or HMOs.
HMOs, right. I remember reading about those.
These are complex sugars in breast milk that humans, the babies themselves, actually can't digest. They didn't evolve to feed the baby directly.
So what do they feed?
They evolved strictly to feed the beneficial microbes in the infant's gut, particularly a group called bifidobacterium. It's literally nature's way of programming the early microbiome, giving the good guys a head start, and providing critical protection.
Wow. Nature's first prebiotic, basically.
Exactly. And the sources also touch on potential links between breastfeeding and brain development, maybe through hormones like oxytocin released during nursing, or perhaps even metabolites produced by those gut microbes like GABA influencing the developing brain. It's just an astonishingly intricate, evolutionarily designed system.
It really is. Okay,
Yeah.
so it's clear that early programming sets the stage. But what about the most direct daily influence we have on this inner ecosystem? Let's talk diet. Section 5. Diet, feeding your inner ecosystem.
Makes sense. You are what you eat, and so are your microbes.
Right. It's logical that what you eat fundamentally changes the living conditions for your gut microbes. The sources draw this really stark contrast between the high microbial diversity seen in groups like the Yanomami,
Who eat an incredibly diverse, mostly plant-based diet, lots of fiber, fermented foods.
right, compared to the much more restrictive gut microbiota and the loss of maybe up to 1/3 of microbial diversity seen in people living in industrialized societies with Western diets.
And the sources really emphasize that it's not just about the total number of different species you have, but their function. It's about what they do.
Yeah.
They introduce this concept of keystone species. Like there's one called Ruminococcus bromii that's essential for breaking down resistant starch, which is a key nutrient for lots of other beneficial microbes.
So if you lose that keystone species,
Exactly. If it's missing from your westernized microbiome, which it often is, then the overall function and resilience of your whole gut ecosystem can be compromised, even if you try to eat healthy foods sometimes. The downstream microbes don't get fed properly. It's like that Yellowstone wolf analogy, or thinking about an orchestra. You need the key players, the interactions between them, for the whole thing to work right.
that makes sense. And the modern North American diet, typically high in animal fat, low in diverse plants, full of processed stuff and chemicals,
Yeah.
seems to be a major driver of this functional loss.
Absolutely. Excessive animal fat and sugar aren't just factors in weight gain, though they are that too. The sources show they contribute significantly to chronic low-grade inflammation throughout the body.
How does that work exactly? What's the mechanism?
Well, the sources explain a key mechanism here involves molecules called LPS, lipopolysaccharides. High-fat meals, unfortunately, tend to feed certain types of gram-negative bacteria in your gut that produce a lot of LPS.
Okay, LPS. Bad news.
Pretty much. Think of it like bacterial waste or a toxin. When these bacteria thrive on that high-fat diet, and especially if your gut lining becomes leakier, which that kind of diet also tends to promote, this LPS can slip through the gut barrier.
Leaky gut.
Right. And it triggers this low-grade inflammatory response throughout your body, not just in the gut. The source calls this state metabolic toxemia.
Metabolic toxemia.
And this chronic systemic inflammation, it doesn't just stay local, it travels. And it can actually mess with crucial centers in your brain, particularly the hypothalamus, which is supposed to be controlling your appetite and metabolism.
Which links directly to this whole idea of food addiction, right? The sources suggest the modern food environment, Hyperpalatable, easily accessible junk food everywhere can just overwhelm the brain's ancient reward and appetite control systems, especially if that hypothalamus is already kind of compromised by chronic inflammation from your diet.
It's a vicious cycle. And the hidden dangers in food additives are also really significant here. The sources cite those powerful Suez studies.
The ones on artificial sweeteners and emulsifiers.
Exactly. Showing that artificial sweeteners like saccharin, sucralose, aspartame, and emulsifiers, which are super common in processed foods to improve texture, they don't just pass through harmlessly.
No.
No. They fundamentally alter the gut microbiota, often in ways similar to a high-fat diet. And they can actually induce metabolic problems and inflammation. In the mice studies, they could even transfer these negative effects just by transplanting the altered microbes.
Seriously? So is the microbes causing the problems?
It strongly suggests that, yeah, the sources are pretty clear. Artificial sweeteners don't seem to help with weight loss in the long run and might actively damage the gut-brain axis. And emulsifiers seem to increase gut leakiness and inflammation.
And these ingredients are often found together in processed foods, right?
Very often. Which can unfortunately trap people in this cycle of inflammation, dysregulated eating, and poor health. It's quite concerning.
It really is powerful to realize how much impact these seemingly small dietary components can have. Okay, shifting gears slightly, let's talk about something maybe a bit more personal, more intuitive. Your gut instincts, biological intuition.
Ah, yes, the gut feelings.
We all talk about having them, right? Trust your gut. Well, the sources explore the very real biological basis for this.
Yeah.
They mention Dr. Bud Craig's work and the role of a brain region called the insula and the salience network.
Right, the insula is key.
Absolutely key, it seems, for sensing and processing signals from the body, everything happening inside us. This sense is called interoception.
And those gut sensations, I mean, everything from feeling nauseous to comfortably full after a meal to that nervous flutter you get, they are constantly being relayed up to the brain. And they contribute significantly to our emotional feelings, how we experience the world.
And the sources explain that how sensitive your brain is to these signals, your sort of internal volume knob or threshold, it varies a lot from person to person.
Yeah, that heartbeat detection study they mention is fascinating.
The one where people who were better at sensing their own heartbeat?
They showed more activity in that insular region and also tended to score higher on empathy tests.
So the more viscerally aware you are of your internal state, the more emotionally attuned you might be, both to yourself and maybe even to others.
It suggests a deep connection between body awareness and emotional intelligence.
And the source suggests that maybe our earliest gut feelings, that raw distress signal of hunger as an infant being registered as bad, and the comfort and satiety from breast milk being registered as good, might actually lay a fundamental foundation for learning what feels good and bad more generally.
Like the basis for value judgments.
Potentially.
Yeah.
It could influence our later moral judgments and even our ability to trust our intuition. The author points out, Freud talked about early gut experiences with his oral and anal phases.
Right.
But he completely missed the crucial biological contribution of the gut-brain microbe signaling in shaping these early experiences and their long-term impact.
And the brain uses this vast library, this emotional video library, as the source calls it, of past gut feelings to guide incredibly rapid, intuitive decisions later on.
How does that work?
Well, instead of consciously weighing every single pro and con, which is slow, the brain essentially predicts how a potential action will feel based on past experiences where similar gut sensations were involved. It accesses that stored gut feeling associated with a similar past situation.
Ah, okay. So it's like a shortcut based on feeling.
Exactly. It allows for quick, often pretty reliable decisions and lets us learn from past painful experiences without having to consciously relive all the unpleasant details every time.
And just to connect this back to physical health one last time, the sources briefly mention that potential link between chronic gut issues, like constipation being an early warning sign sometimes, and neurodegenerative disorders like Parkinson's. The idea that the disease process might actually start in the gut and travel up the vagus nerve to the brain, potentially involving the microbiome in that process. It just really shows how far-reaching the impact of this gut-brain axis can be.
Right.
It's way beyond just digestive symptoms or intuition.
It truly underscores that this isn't just about digestion. It seems fundamental to our overall physical health, our mental well-being, even our cognition and how we navigate the world. It's all connected.
So after this whole deep dive, pulling all these threads together, let's look at Section 7. Practical steps for optimizing the conversation, because we want to know what we can actually do, right?
Right. The key takeaway here, as we've been saying, is that this brain-gut microbiota conversation is absolutely constant, and it impacts our entire well-being. So improving that conversation is key.
Okay, so what are some concrete, actionable steps based on the sources?
Well, a major one, based on everything we've discussed, is dialing back the animal fat and dramatically increasing the amount and diversity of plant-based foods, especially fiber.
Feed the good bugs.
Exactly. That's crucial for maximizing gut microbial diversity and resilience. The Mediterranean diet gets highlighted as a really well-researched example.
Yeah, why that one specifically?
It seems to benefit both gut and brain health, likely because it emphasizes diverse plants, lots of vegetables, fruits, legumes, nuts, seeds, healthy fats like olive oil, which is rich in polyphenols that beneficial microbes love, and typically lower meat consumption, especially red meat with more fish.
Okay, so lots of plants, healthy fats, less animal fat. What else?
The sources also touch on the potential benefits of intermittent fasting or just giving your gut a break between meals.
How does that help?
It seems to activate something called the migrating motor complex, which is basically your gut's built-in street sweeping function. These waves of muscle contractions clear out lingering debris and bacteria between meals. Research is still ongoing, but allowing that process to happen regularly seems beneficial.
Interesting. The gut's housekeeping system.
Pretty much. And remembering that powerful gut-emotion connection we talked about,
Yeah.
the sources really emphasize being mindful of your emotional state while you're eating. Eating when you're stressed, angry, anxious. It can directly negatively impact your digestion, and it can also drive poor food choices, right? You reach for comfort food.
Guilty as charged.
Yeah.
Creates that negative feedback loop.
Exactly. The stories of Frank and Bill really illustrate how intertwined our emotional state, diet, and gut symptoms can be.
So managing stress is key for the gut too. And the sources suggest therapies focused on the brain's playbook, right?
Yes, things like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, or hypnosis specifically tailored for gut disorders, and mindfulness practices, these can be incredibly effective. Well, these interventions don't just improve the brain-gut symptoms like pain or discomfort, but they also often help with the associated anxiety and depression. And remarkably, they've even been shown to physically change brain wiring and how we appraise stressful situations over time.
Wow. So you can retrain your brain-gut communication.
To some extent, yes. The sources also note that sometimes low-dose psychotropic medications can be a helpful tool, not necessarily as antidepressants per se, but more to help calm an overactive stress response in the nervous system that's driving gut symptoms.
Okay. So wrapping this up.
Yeah.
This incredible constant communication between your brain, your gut, and those trillions of microbes you host, it profoundly shapes your health, your feelings, your decisions, basically every single day.
It really does. And in our unprecedented modern environment, with diets so fundamentally different from what we evolved eating, constant exposure to chemicals, medications like antibiotics, pervasive chronic stress, understanding this connection is arguably more crucial than ever. It's not just about treating diagnosed diseases anymore. It's really about actively striving for optimal health and resilience, a state that the sources suggest very few people in modern society are actually achieving right now.
That's a powerful reminder, isn't it? That our inner world is just as complex, just as dynamic, and just as vital as the world around us. And that nourishing it, paying attention to it, is absolutely key to our overall well-being.
Couldn't agree more.
So here's maybe a provocative thought for you, the listener, to consider after this deep dive. How much are you currently listening to the conversation your body is having with itself? How much attention are you paying to those gut feelings, to the food you're putting in, to how you manage stress? And how might paying closer attention impact your overall well-being and your health, not just today, but years down the line? It's a complex, vital connection, definitely worth exploring further in your own life.